experts on privacy and copyright and some of these broader issues about the network society. Yochai Benkler from Harvard, the author of The Wealth of Networks, who's been thinking about the network world for quite some time and looking at it very deeply. And Christopher Yu from Penn Law here, who works on issues of technology and telecom and competition policy, the head of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition. He'll be the discussant, and Julie's going to go first.
Thank you, Kevin, and I'm really glad to be here. So
All yours.
what I'm going to talk to you about is drawn from this book that is about 2/3 of the way written. I'm not going to try. Now it's on. Good. So the place where I want to pick up in the conversation we've been having is with the motivating question for this entire project that I'm engaged in, which is a narrative about law's role in the information economy and everything that we've just been talking about that bothered me for a really long time, right? And that's the narrative of the irresistible force meeting the immovable object, and which one you think is law and which one you think is information technology is entirely up to you, right? But then the narrative dictates the form of the answers, which have been these, right? Depending on your perspective, how should law respond, which is kind of the regulator's perspective, and why doesn't the law just get out of the way, which is the Silicon Valley perspective. And I don't find these questions very productive because they assume away law's role in already producing everything that is going on. So what I would like to encourage you all to focus on, and what I want to talk to you about, is this narrative. Newly valuable resources, right, networks, algorithms, data, engender new appropriation strategies. Some of those strategies are legal institutional strategies, by which I mean some of those strategies, indeed most of those strategies, involve mobilizing what is already there in the legal environment to get done what you want to happen. And if that is your narrative, then this is your question, right? This is my question anyway. How are legal institutions already changing or evolving as they are mobilized by interested actors to solve these new problems? Law is already responding. Law has always already been responding. Let me make the dynamic a little bit more concrete by talking about the previous large instance of this, the Great Transformation, adopting the framework offered by Karl Polanyi a long time ago, ages ago in internet years. So Polanyi talked about the movement to a capitalist political economy and sketched a story that moved in sort of three large parts, a story about the appropriation of land and raw materials to construct the valuable things in the new political economy, a story about a reconceptualization of existing resources, learning to see labor, land, and money as commodities, right, essential factors of production, of capitalist production, and a process of reorganization through which patterns of barter and exchange that were inherently local were kind of detached from their local sites and re-embedded in this fictionalized construct of the market, which doesn't exist in a place anywhere, right? It's an imaginary thing. Those three processes produced, as he described it, a double movement comprised of a first movement to a capitalist political economy, followed by a moment that's sort of strikingly like the one that the first panel today described, right? The, oh my God, what have we done moment, where people gradually we're forced to take stock of mounting costs to human well-being, pollution, people getting their limbs chopped off in factories, workers, people being displaced from farmland and shunted off to cities and working 15 hours a day in terrible conditions. And then the second movement, the protective counter movement, during which the law responded, right? But what I want to stress to you is that even the first movement to a capitalist political economy was also and necessarily a story about the productive mobilization of law in the first place, right? The laws that permitted enclosure of lands, the laws that permitted the construction of factories, the laws that enabled the corporate form to be created and to exist in a way that allowed the aggregation of capital in sufficient amounts and at sufficient scale to get large industrial projects done. Law was involved first, not just later. Both the movement and the counter movement are stories about the productive mobilization of law. Okay. What is going on now, I submit to you, is a very similar set of processes. Resources that are being appropriated now are, for the most part, intangible resources, traditional stuff of intellectual property lawyers' dreams, like patents and copyrights and trade secrets, but also lots of other kind of funky intangible things that are hard to classify within traditional intellectual property taxonomies, data of various sorts, and a reconceptualization of the basic factors of production through which they're not just to be seen as commodities, but to be seen and to be understood as inherently reaching their highest value when they are dematerialized and datafied. We see labor being transformed into streams of data, not just in the gig economy, but before through the sort of geographic dispersal and just-in-timeness of production in various industries. Land, think about the mortgage crisis. Think really hard about all that mortgage-backed securitization, and you can tell a really interesting story about the dematerialization and datafication of interest in land. And money. Right, the missing story from the first panel today, I think, although it came up a little bit, is money. Right, we are used to putting the market that consists of shares in publicly traded companies under a microscope, and we're looking, as a result of only putting that part of money under a microscope, at probably about 10% of what is going on right now. Just pulling that number out of thin air. Money is being datafied. Right, Alibaba and Tencent are becoming banks, oh my God, right, which takes us to the reorganization. I submit to you that what is going on right now on an organizational level is that patterns of barter and exchange are now becoming detached from the fictionalized, idealized construct of the market and being rematerialized and re-embedded in platforms. Okay, the platform is the core organizational form of the emerging information economy. So what do we have here? An ongoing movement to informational capitalism. Protective counter movements? That's kind of what the first panel today was also about. Do we need them? Where are they? And both parts of this story are also and necessarily a story about the productive mobilization and maybe still to come the counter mobilization of law. To put it a different way, the double movement to a capitalist political economy can be thought of as, at least when you focus on what happened to legal institutions, as a story through which the legal institutions of sort of agrarian life were optimized for the industrial economy. And I mean to use the term optimized neutrally. I don't necessarily mean they became perfect or more just, but they became optimized. We are watching now, I think, legal institutions becoming optimized to the informational economy, again, without meaning to connote anything about whether those institutions are becoming fairer or more just. And what I want to do in this project is sketch the ways that that is happening. And for my purposes today, it will suffice just to pull out some themes that relate to the topic of networks, which is our topic for this afternoon. So I want to focus on sets of emerging entitlements and disentitlements in information as they relate to flows of information that happen over networks. And then I want to talk a bit about network coordination and standardization as a new or emergent legal institutional template. In other words, a new way of organizing not just governance, but law. So return to the platforms point to begin with. We could dig into this in the Q&A. To sort of boil it all down for you, the things that platforms do which drive toward making participants in the information economy more legible, at least to platforms, although not necessarily to those participants themselves, are made possible in part by the infrastructure, right, by the intermediation, by the modularized protocols that Christian et al. Have written about and others have written about so nicely. But they are made possible in part by acts of legal entrepreneurship, right? Those boilerplate terms of service, the boilerplate contracts that developers have to enter into. There are really active entrepreneurial performative processes of enclosure of data and inputs and resources that platforms, data brokers, and others are actively engaged in. That is a process of mobilizing, again, law productively to produce this movement to an information economy. Do we really need, in regard to the last panel, extra incentives to produce data? I'm sorry, but I just have to object, right? We are living through a massive socio-technical reorganization of our networked information environment for data cultivation and harvesting, sucking in flows from communications, from sensors, from the Internet of Things, from policing, from development, and this process is being extended out across the developing world. It's not just happening here. Think Facebook Free Basics, right? Think initiatives in Africa to give people access to mobile banking over their phones and finance it by sharing the data with the phone companies and the banks. It's all over the place. And that reorganization is again being accompanied by an active legal entrepreneurship that configures all of this sucking in of raw material as a new public domain of personal data, and vest legal privilege in that information in those who collect it and process it and make it productive. It is accompanied by narratives about surveillance as innovation and virtue, and it makes the data and the algorithms subjects of legal privilege that is vested in the processors, not the sources of the data. Not done yet. What about fake news? What about neuromarketing and behavioral advertising? What about CDA 230? It was kind of an accident, right? Because at the time CDA 230 is crafted, we don't yet have a Google, we don't yet have a Facebook. But at some point, there emerged and is still being crafted and solidified a set of strategies to manufacture and deepen and extend legal immunity from accountability for information harms. It is not just CDA 230, although CDA 230 is a highly visible piece. It's the set of now deeply internalized norms that media regulators follow that position owners of media infrastructures as sort of definitionally immune from most media regulation because the media that they own is also their speech. It is the ridiculous conversation about whether or not to do the tiny little thing of enacting data breach notification laws, just to tell people, right, not to actually make Equifax accountable, but just to tell people And oh my goodness, the hue and cry over whether consumers really need to know all of this stuff because it would make them more fearful. That we are manufacturing legal immunities, and correlatively, to harken back to our good old friend Hofeld from the early 20th century, correlative disabilities on the part of information users. And finally, and sometimes that cross purposes with the immunity logics, a set of logics around interdiction and control of information flows because they are dangerous, because they are other people's property, like IP digital contraband, because the government has claims about needing to keep its operations secret. And those logics become mobilized as legal interdiction rules, but also as technical interdiction rules, because interestingly enough, the platforms we see pushing back. So if I were a game theorist, I could probably start babbling about a three-way multi-stage game between governments, platforms, and IP owners about the control of information, but I will spare you because I'm not. But we have, some of these logics would say, regulate the platforms, right? Let people sue Twitter and Facebook for circulating terrorist information. But that's not how it's panning out. Right? There is a very complex process of sort of power realignment going on in which not just governments but platforms are positioning themselves as powerful sources of governance authority. Okay, enough about that. I'm sure I've thrown some grenades and people will want to talk about that a little more later. But I want to say a thing about networked governance. So I have a whole bunch of stories that I tell in the second part of the book about the first three lines on this slide. If what one wants to do is re-optimize existing legal and regulatory institutions for the information economy, and one looks at the existing judicial system, the existing regulatory state, the existing human rights framework, from the perspective of a platform or an information broker, there are sort of large, obvious defects. And so I have stories to tell about processes in which those institutions are sort of morphing and being disciplined, right? And in ways that sort of get some of their more troublesome aspects out of the way. I'm happy to say things about that later. It certainly bears on the conversation we had about the Communications Act. But what I want to talk about instead in my final few minutes is the emergence of a new class of transnational governance institutions that I'd like to suggest are actually the beginnings, and even more than just the beginnings, of a new legal institutional model based on network laws and more particularly on mandated network standardization. And we're going to begin here. Everybody knows this, right? I like this fine, but it's naive. This is how it is. Power interprets regulation as damage and routes around it in the society we have. And particularly that is the case when legal institutions become networked. So look at these three interesting clusters of networked governance that are emerging in the world that we see as lawyers. World trade governance emerging on a networked model, really awesome path-breaking work by John Braithwaite and Peter Drahos from Australia on this. Strong norms of liberalization and flow, and also David Grewal at Yale. But mysteries, right? The apparent breakdown of the GATT as a coordinating mechanism, persistent concerns about capture and inaccessibility, and really weird stuff going on under multiple rubrics about cross-border information flows, which people can't seem to decide whether they should be regulated under the rubric of trade and services or trade and financial services or just trade, or privacy, or multilateral legal assistance treaties in criminal and national security matters. It's getting a little crazy. Transnational business regulation is another area in which sub-state networked models of cooperation and compliance regulation are emerging. And people look at these and they say, these look weird from a legal perspective. Lawmaking and enforcement, a traditional dichotomy that lawyers like to hold to, collapse into each other. The regulatory instruments like the financial stability standards that we see the banks sort of converging on are really technical. Again, some really flashpoint disputes over what to do about cross-border information flows. And finally, internet governance, about which many people in this room know a lot, right? IETF, ICANN, et cetera. If we think about these processes as not simply governance processes, but as sort of sketching the sort of nascent beginnings of a new kind of legal institutional model, here's what I think we ought to be focusing on, and this is my last slide. We've got regulation, we've got law being made via a network organization that includes hubs, right? The US has outsized influence in many of these processes. And we see precisely that network standardization drives the collapse of lawmaking into enforcement, right? There's not a lot of daylight between those two things when the question is whether you complied with a network standard. We see battles about change in the legal standard that play out as standards wars, right? What's going to happen with the breakaway group of developing nations that's trying to fight a standards war over IP, trade, governance? What's going to happen now that the US has pulled out of TPP and the Asian group is sort of breaking away and trying to come up with a different trade model? Are the APEC privacy principles going to trump the GDPR? No pun intended. And we see new models of participation within this template for networked law-making that are just by traditional standards odd. Traditionally, we think of accountability as emerging either via delegation to elected representatives or via direct public participation, but networked governance rewards, demonstrates returns to scale. So we see what I like to think of as extreme multi-stakeholderism, right? Technically, we have multi-stakeholder models of governance, but you do best within the world of extreme multi-stakeholderism if you're a large transnational entity that can play in multiple fora at once. And you see counter networks of NGOs being formed to try to counter the power of the TNCs. We have a network standards model of legal content emerging in which the standards are highly technical. There's a crazy, funny article about the new, I think it's ISO 26000, and a standard for corporate social responsibility that you need like a PhD to read. And it's not something I would venture to say that many, grassroots corporate social responsibility activists could understand. And we have also some interesting questions about the role of platforms within this model of network governance, because platforms are hubs, right, in some very concrete, practical ways, which raises the question whether they are sovereigns or should be understood as sovereigns, which from a traditional international law perspective is totally incoherent. So I'm done because I've probably taken too much time. But I think that that when we want to ask how is law responding, we should check ourselves. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to give exactly the same talk, but as the modern Major General says, this time really fast. We're facing two major crises in democratic market societies: a dramatic increase in inequality, of which we are a particularly extreme version, and a rise of ethno-nationalism, of ethno-national authoritarianism emerging across the world, both in democratic and non-democratic, both in advanced and non-advanced countries. And when we ask the question, why are you so down, as it was asked this morning, about what has happened, it's when you live in a country in which the only population in the entire developed world that has seen mortality rates rise is US white population, and you live in a context of a proto-fascist success in an election, you can't sit happy. We did okay with the internet. So what's technology got to do with it? The dominant economic model of the last 30 years has been skills-biased technical change. It is the foundational intellectual structure around the robots will eat all the jobs and platforms will destroy everything. And it sees technology as deterministically influencing markets that are themselves each exogenous to the other. So old-style skills-biased technical change starts with product markets and labor markets that are roughly efficient. Technology changes the relative productivity of skills, which then differentiates across models, across values. This one assumed monotonically increasing return to education and was developed in the 90s, correct for the 80s. The 90s didn't look the same because people in the middle lost rather than people at the bottom and the top. So a new theory version was developed, the task framework, which is the intellectual template of robots, and that's that our routine and non-routine and cognitive and non-cognitive work, and routine work is what the middle class does, and that can get automated. Again, notice critically, the markets are all efficient. Everything happens on the outside. The problem with that is it fit the 90s, but not the 80s and what's happened since 2000. It fit the US in the 90s, but not Germany and other countries in the same technological frontier. Again, we have a new version of it in the 2010s. It's a little bit in trouble. So instead, it's institutions. The best version of SBTC, of the classical SBTC, is Golden and Katz, and it does see institutions, but notice specifically it's about education policy. The market remains largely efficient. Technology and skills are largely, technology and markets are largely exogenous to each other, and institutions play in the distribution of skills. By contrast, throughout this period, there's been a lot of work in labor economics that sees markets as primarily arenas of power structured by institutions, and the critical econometrically measured dynamics of inequality are union decline, minimum wage laws, that is, say, political power through minimum wage laws, union power, and how it implements through political and norms power, macroeconomic policy that's more focused on inflation as opposed to on full employment. Interesting about all of this that it gives a minimal role to technology. One gives too much of a role to technology, one gives not enough of a role to technology. So what is the story that we are telling that could be both? I'll just highlight, let's not forget, and then there's the Hacker and Pearson component from winner-take-all politics, which essentially also locates the institutional change and the fundamental transformation in the 70s and the rise of organized business, the Chamber of Commerce, the rise of, and the Business Roundtable, and the rise of lobbying that then pushed the institutions that created this inequality. Again, a minimal role for technology. A big project I'm working on now is trying to excavate from the 70s how we connect technology to this, and this will connect to the future. So a version of the story is in the 60s. This is essentially relative education and relative wage in the financial industry. A big story is that in the 60s and 70s, you see a dramatic set of innovations in theories of finance. They do not get reduced to actual practice until PCs get in, at which point you get the LBOs and the CDOs that really jump things up, and then later on algorithmic trading. The limitation, so this is a story in which technology is a critical enabling tool set with which to implement within a possibility set. But the same exact correlation also occurs with regard to deregulation. And so we know the standard story of neoliberalism, the Reagan moment, etc. But there's also what happens in the 60s and 70s is a shift in the left. So Ralph Nader and the Nader Raiders are as important as Stigler and the Virginia School in introducing the idea of agency capture and questioning the possibility of effective markets. The rise of self-actualization and individual is as important as rational actor theory and the neoliberal version to focus things on the individual as opposed to on the solidaristic. So we see the combination of a shift in ideology and law allowing a certain way to happen with the technology, and at the same time also mixing with what we saw with executive compensation, which also has an inflection point at exactly the same time. And while there's great work from Bedchik and Fried and others showing that this was not about efficiency and could not be explained by the new technologies that allowed for more efficient and expanded control over systems, the timing is best explained by social norms. You've got Holmstrom and Kaplan talking about LBO norms. You've got Khurana talking about managerial market norms. You've got Western and Rosenfeld talking about unions and norms. There's a major managerial norm change here. Part of what I've been adding to this is looking at knowledge changes. This is also the time at which high-end knowledge invents the legitimating ideas of shareholder value and agency theory that actually justify a certain mode that brings executive compensation in line with the S&P 500. Essentially what you get is knowledge and popular culture creating a set of normative changes. This is a spaghetti ball you don't really need to read in details. Connecting with politics and law that feed both into financial markets and managerial markets, and together create a shift, a fundamental shift in labor markets, and push both the affordances of social, the technology into a model of disinvestment from labor and financialization. To abstract from that, think of it as a dynamic between ideology, technology, and institutions that primarily focuses on power over economy, polity, kinship, and culture, whose primary project is about fighting over power over the magnitude, the defensibility, and the bargaining power over the rents if it's in the economy, the influence if it's in other systems of power. And it's played across technology, institutions, and knowledge. Any one of you who's seen investment in studies of any subject you've looked at, you will understand the fight over knowledge, with feedback loops and punctuated equilibria. That's the basic model reduced. So if you look at 46 to 70, you see the technologies of the assembly line of electrification, internal combustion, etc., fitting into high modernism and the idea and the epistemology of standardization and expertise, and managerialism, Taylorism, Fordism, etc., the administrative state. We know this story. We also know, and I've already mentioned both the left and the right version of choice in free markets, rational actor theory, but also self-actualization, pluralist egalitarianism, etc., how these fit with a particular set of technologies in production that allowed both for globalization and for financialization, and a set of values about institutions that are so embedded that we saw them this afternoon in the first panel, still talking about the limitations of regulation. Critically, it didn't happen the same way in all countries. All countries at the same technological frontier did not have the same mode of liberalization. All did have increase in information, all did have liberalization, but they worked in different ways with different effects. So that in effect, the period we're talking about, the period in which Digital Tornado comes out, is this period at the height of the neoliberal moment, at the height of pluralist oligarchy as the reigning ideology and the reigning institutional structure. And that period reflects it, and reflects it obviously most clearly in the techno-libertarian version. Let's give Barlow his due. Basically, and the Silicon Valley sense of leave us. So it's essentially, it's leave us be, and technology will eliminate scarcity. What happened, which Tim was sort of pushing back when Niva was asking him, was the emergence of a set of practices, free and open source software, the success of the Internet Engineering Task Force, etc., that created the possibility of a new epistemology and a new way of knowing the world, which you can think of as C.S. Purser's fallibilism, the idea of knowledge as practice, knowledge in communities of practice, which we all feel in our fingers when we say things like rough consensus and running code, late binding design, loosely coupled systems, release early, release often, but also in the Agile Manifesto. It's not just about what's outside of the business. This a basic idea that things are inherently fallible. This is true of both the state and the market. That's the critical difference from the neoliberal moment that was also skeptical about planned systems, was the rejection of price systems as themselves infallible, and the acceptance of the possibility of non-market models. So many of us cut our teeth on these battles, and I look at all the faces that are of old friends and familiar friends. We've all fought these battles around commons and property and opens and closed on both sides of them, played out in IP, in privacy, in telecoms, in spectrum, in encryption. This was the core battle of the time because it was possible. It was possible because the technological stack and the multi-system stack lined up on open models. So you had a social-cultural battle of the netheads versus the bellheads, organizationally the IETF, W3C, FOSS, the technical layer of TCP, IP, and HTML, and the open APIs. The law happened to be common carrier because it was over copper. Antitrust was still playing, unbundling at this time was still playing, and succeeded in Europe. One thing nobody talked about today is the Europeans see the unbundling as a success there. We only think we have not 4, 1.5 competitors. We don't have 4. We just have 4 companies, each of which is a regional monopoly. And markets were all open, so that it wasn't the antitrust case that created Firefox. It was the combination, perhaps, of the antitrust, but fundamentally, the conceptual capability of turning the code over from Netscape that was no longer viable to a free and open source community development project, which would have been inconceivable 5 years earlier when the antitrust case was brought. So we have this shift from industrial information production to network information production across multiple vectors. And what happened in the 2010s is that there's all been reconcentrated into platforms. And you have an inversion of the structure without an inversion of the content production system. You have a centralized structure across all of these. Essentially what we're seeing is, if you think of Tiananmen Square just before, all of these prize-winning photos look exactly the same because they're all from where the reporters were allowed to sit. By contrast, when you look at Egyptian tank man from the Arab Spring, if you look at the foundational change of American debate over the killing of black men by police officers, these were fundamentally about an inversion and democratization, which is still there, of the capacity to set the agenda. We saw the ethic of suddenly I'm living here, in the case of Philando Castile, of broadcasting live. And then within a few months, it turns out Facebook has an off switch that the police can call. And we suddenly understood the concentration, and as of the last election, Facebook becomes the epicenter of the epistemic crisis in which we find ourselves. What's happened? The technological stack completely changed. Not that TCP isn't there, not that Spectrum Commons hasn't worked, not that HTML isn't there yet, but around them, below and above, the smartphone became the core computational device, which then shifted to wireless companies, which then created the first platform as an app store model, the cloud services, and above that. We saw then, after this was copied, the effort for Windows 10 to move to an app store model and the development around that. It completely changed the institutional system that interacted with it, ranging from social-cultural moves, as Bruce Schneier puts it, with fear and convenience driving as the framework of an incapable consumer instead of an active user and co-developer and co-creator. The organizational system is all internal. The technical system is all proprietary standards and DRM. The law of voluntary enforcement, EULAs, etc. And the market is that tippy market with a complete orientation towards security and customer service. That's for me. I have so much time. Whew, who knew? Like I said, this time faster. I didn't copy this from Julie. It was right up here, and this is a PDF sign. Rent-seeking sees openness as damage and routes around it. That's, I think, what we both are trying to capture as a lesson that we didn't have a decade ago, was the extent to which you could win the battles at what we thought were the critical infrastructural choke points, and still lose because around them new points of control would develop, new organizational and social models would emerge, and they would then capture the system. And of course, this is before we add the critical thing that is absolutely critical, which is data, as Victor was talking about earlier. And essentially, critically here, again, just echoing what Victor said earlier, the incumbents are now controlling troves which become the non-replicable infrastructure around which everything else moves. It becomes the local loop. And then the question is, do we know how to work with the local loop? We have some experience. But again, you have data-driven marketing and data-driven management, critical to machine learning and AI, and the other major ideological move is the move in the behavioral sciences to understand experimentally based large-scale manipulation of behavior as the critical additional thing we know how to do. So this then ripples through the entire system. It ripples through systems for the control of material processes, which then impact both labor and the movement of physical things. This is probably not going to be Facebook, though it might be Alphabet. They're certainly going there. This is about data becoming the critical infrastructure for control over all the physical processes. The networked organization is not new. Castells wrote about it 20 years ago as a phenomenon that was already there for 20 years. But we're seeing it increased and expanded much more broadly. We're seeing reputation and trust, supply and demand availability, and critically experimentally informed, behaviorally managed monopsony and monopoly pricing in both labor and services market. Shoshana's sitting there, that's surveillance capitalism. That's the critical aspect of it. We're sitting here with rich individualized data and behavioral marketing, creating fine-grained manipulations of beliefs, preferences, understood possibilities of constraints and actions, which is to say, acts. Where's Brett on programmable people? This is what we're talking about. Essentially, we have incumbent platforms that exercise increasing amounts of power by controlling their existing troves over both competing platforms on the same technology, competitors trying to replace them. Gigi was talking about Snap earlier, as you were, Tim, on your panel. Innovators on incumbent platforms themselves, that's the relationship. Sellers on two-sided markets, workers in labor markets, both, if you think Williamson, both discipline and price are fully susceptible now to control by one-sided unequal bargaining power. And the fundamental challenge to all the idea of a market liberal society comes from the fact that we depend for liberal markets on the idea of welfare, that is to say, people exogenously know what they want, and then markets do or don't deliver. That's how we know what we know. But if you endogenize demand, it's an incoherent idea. The entire discipline of economics is like the coyote in Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff. They're giving Thaler the Nobel Prize, and they don't see that the whole concept of exogenous preferences is gone. There is no such thing as welfare to maximize when it is endogenous to the market. And what this election has told us is that the same thing may be happening to citizenship. The possibility of self-governance in a pluralist society by the aggregation of preferences of free citizens is impossible when what they want is itself the product of the system in which we're in. When manufacturing of consent and manufacturing of public belief is the central object. So this comes from a project we just did in my research team using 2 million stories from the 18 months before the election. And the thing I want to draw your attention to, more than anything else, is the asymmetry. Technology is not destiny. Technology is not giving us fake news. Norms, institutions, practices enabled by technology are doing it. What we're seeing on the right and what we're seeing in the center left, and the left is not the same. This is the land that started with Rush Limbaugh after the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated. This is the land that Fox News built in '96. And when you bring Russians, or white supremacists on 4chan, or Cambridge Analytica, to an already asymmetric political, social sphere, you get asymmetry. And essentially, we're seeing these four major suspects in what's happened to us. Russia, this is the point Neva was raising about state actors being absolutely central. We see the work on the extreme right wing, the white supremacists on 4chan and Reddit, as notes here, distributed, not centralized. We're seeing the information polluters, essentially commercial practices, this is fake news, people who don't care about politics are only trying to build something commercially and produce epistemic crisis as pollution, and Breitbart, Mercer, Fox News, the Trump campaign, this beautiful quote from Bannon when he joined the campaign. I wouldn't have come aboard, even for Trump, if I hadn't known they were building this massive Facebook and data engine. Facebook is what propelled Breitbart to a massive audience. We know its power. The idea that you can harness these firms to create a level of manipulation of public opinion never before possible becomes the combination between the centralizing and the decentralizing. So essentially, we have these four suspects, and believe me, at the moment, I think as a matter of data, we don't know the comparative contribution of each to the crisis we find ourselves in. It might be centralized state actors who are politically oriented completely. It might be fully decentralized white supremacist mobs trying to do it. It might be commercial actors who don't care about politics and are just spewing nonsense as pollution. Or it might be this mix of political, commercial model that we might think of as Ailes and Murdoch and Bannon and Mercer playing this role and leveraging the data capabilities of Google and Facebook. But these are the sources of our epistemic crisis, and this is where we need to look for them. What did I do wrong? Sorry about that. I'll toll my limitations. These are the no-exit companies. There's no exit. Voice is highly manipulable, and regulation is limited. Essentially, to conclude, what we have here is a moment where a class of technologies has hit a particular moment where our regulatory framework is definitely still stuck in the techno-libertarian fear. We have a resurgent economic nationalism with a corporatist idea about how to govern economy, but a fundamentally an oligarchic and authoritarian structure being pushed across the world as if we don't do this right, this is where we'll end up, at least some of us. That to me is what's pushing. I think my mistake, the mistake of those who thought like me and me, was the inability to predict the extent of the power that could happen around the social and distributed models, the failure modes of social production alongside the failure modes of the market, that social production was not immune to fallibilism any more than markets or state were. And so we need some kind of solution that involves the state, municipalities, more traditional organizations, and networks together with these distributed models. And then this question of where the state will come in, with nudge progressively being one model, let's just give us data and have better government, but really torn between these two competing ideologies. One that still wants to keep the government relatively small and project out to market actors, and the other that tries to build a more socially embedded, coming back to Polanyi, a more socially embedded organization, something that's more like Barcelona than Amsterdam in thinking of the relationship between a municipality and the sharing economy around it. Thanks.
Well, it's my privilege to comment on these papers, or these presentations, not papers yet. Very forcefully presented commentaries about putting pretty dim picture of where we are right now. And consistent with the themes of the conference, and I find myself thinking, I feel like I'm defending Kevin's original paper in some ways, but it's just, it's kind of interesting. So what I always think of when I hear ideas like this is I'm always reminded of an adage, never think your competitor or your boss is an idiot, which is, if it were really clear, this policy debate would be very short, very easy, and it always makes me wonder what's on the other side, and to try to develop that, to try to understand it as well as we can. And I accept the papers in the spirit which they're given. They are presented against a perception of an orthodoxy of technoliberalism, and they're trying to create a plausible case, a possibility theorem for a different approach. I accept that. That's a good move in the first instance, but in the end, the final resolution will have to require saying, okay, so that's that on the one side, let's identify the things on the other side, and then create some metric for balancing them all off. And one of the interesting things that the critique is generally that I love the fact that Yochai mentions John Perry Barlow, is that the techno-liberal utopians were probably overstated, and that there were problems on the other side. And there's no question that's true. But it's funny, it's not just the techno-liberals, I'm always struck by what people would call the two most important laws in tech for the last 20 years. That would be Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law. And what we've learned is that Moore's Law basically said, oh, we get something for nothing because costs always go down. First, we have to remember that was actually a technology-specific claim. It's not a general claim about the entire digital economy, which is something we forget. And second, because it's a technological claim, it was based on a particular technological strategy, which we've now exhausted. And in fact, that is nothing inevitable, and I find that in fact, what we see is everything hits diminishing returns eventually, and you don't get there. So these claims that we get something for nothing, that really drove a lot of the techno-liberal philosophy, it's wrong. We've seen it. We're hitting Moore's Law's limits now. Metcalfe's Law says value will grow quadratically. Metcalfe himself says nothing grows quadratically forever. That's what we call Ponzi schemes. We know that they don't work. And that in fact, there's a lot of other forces going on in terms of, there are clear virtues to scale, but there will be eventual diseconomies. And as some people have said, there's a lot of other devices that make them, that deproblematize them. Multi-homing, gateways, and other, even imperfect, bringing them not as two networks as part of one, large customers, or as Herb mentioned earlier, heterogeneity of preferences creates stable equilibria where it's not in your best interest to join a big network even though it's more valuable if you value a different approach more. And so we see these incredible claims where big is better and all that. They're just not that simple. And we've learned that techno-optimists probably overstated their claim. I would like to make that same lesson the other way. We're in a moment where sort of techno-pessimism is the coin of the realm. My guess is, I have a kid who's a freshman in college, and he got his first bad grades on midterms. And I'm trying to tell him, you don't ride too high, don't ride too low. You're never as good as your last good test. You're never as bad as your last bad test. I think we were on the good test before. I'm worried we're on the bad test now. And he blows us all out of proportion. So the question is, there are clear problems, but what are our targets on this? Okay, platforms. Platforms have real problems. We forget, platforms are really good things. Platforms unlock a lot of value. Platforms enable a lot of innovation. It decentralizes innovation. It allows parallel innovation. And that, in fact, we have a lot of real possibilities that are really wonderful about platforms. And that, in fact, platforms typically require scale. We have, say, for example, smartphone platforms. We would not want 10 smartphone platforms. We tried that once. It was called Unix, and it's dead. And so the idea that, in fact, there is a baby in the bathwater on platforms to say that they have their problems. Now, I'm not claiming that they don't, but to suggest one solution, if you problematize them completely, just get rid of them. I don't think any of us would support that. So the question becomes, the hard question now is, how do we create a middle ground, even accepting everything Yochai and Julie have laid out in front of us, to find a way to try to make that work? The other target we have here is data. We forget that, in fact, the data revolution has actually created an enormous number of products that we value highly. So one very simple thing about predictive analytics if you look at the literature on human-computer interaction, we thought that our ability to gain the benefit of digitization would be limited by our ability to stare into a keyboard and type digits. In fact, the predictive analytics and all the sensor-based world is in fact our solution to that it can actually adapt and to take into account and anticipate some problems, so not all of our interactions require us to be staring at a keyboard and typing. And that is actually one of the good things about what we can do, but it only works when you have data. The other things that we forget is, in fact, data is enabled a lot of products, one of the things when we were in business, we had very good tools about querying data and we could ask questions. The question I always wanted to know is, what's the pattern I don't know about? What question am I not asking because there's something new that I should be asking? We never had those tools before. Data allows us to find those things and allows us to find patterns and connections we didn't see before. Again, I'm not trying to idealize it. There are problems, but in fact, we've had a lot of benefits out of this. So we need to understand this. We talk about social media and the problems with politics. I'm going back to what Sally Wentworth said before. In fact, social media has been in the developing world the primary platform for political organization. And it drove a large parts of the Arab Spring. And in fact, people look at it very tremendously as a beneficial thing. And we talk about wealth inequality. In fact, many people in the developing world regard network-based technologies as a force in favor of promoting wealth equality. That in fact it allows them to get access to global markets, allows them to small businesses and other things, because as problematic as our institutions are here, in much of the developing world, they're much, much more so. And that in fact it allows some interesting possibilities. So it's interesting to me, and I'm glad Julie brings up internet governance and alternative forms of governance. We forget that in fact we see a world here where in fact the structures give users a voice for the first time. Civil society a formal part in the process. Business is a formal part of the process, and it's not driven by a regime in which only governments speak a set agendas, and only governments vote. And so we see a much more complicated world, but my guess is that in fact there's opportunities in all of them. Now, we have a tendency to focus on salient concerns because, and in fact, fake news is probably it today. I'm thinking back 20 years. We were talking about at the time of the digital tornado, it was the AOL Time Warner merger. And if we were worried about a platform, it would probably be AOL keywords. That was the key to everything, and now it's a joke. And in fact, looking back, we could see the tendency to think, some big companies will take over the world. I'm always struck by Google's complete failure to fight back against Facebook and social networking. And someone had mentioned the ITA merger. Google Flights sucks and has no significant market share right now. And in fact, what we see is a much more difficult, or what I just have my notes here, Farmville was once an enormous source of concern in policy circles several years ago. So I mean, I don't mean to say that these aren't going to potentially be real concerns, but we do have a tendency to focus on the problems of the moment. And that's not a wrong thing, we need to do that. But we should have the distance to step back and realize that in fact, we're doing this for the long haul. So what's interesting to me is, how different the atmosphere is now from what it was 10 years ago. I mean, go back 20 years ago, that's pre-9/11, but even 10 years ago, the world looked a lot better. Europe was talking about how much it was going to unify. This is pre-Crimea, pre-Ukraine, pre-Syria. And now the world seems much more fragmented, and it's a real problem. And don't get me wrong, it's quite striking. I just don't want us to be hypnotized too much by this. Just like I would hope we're not too hypnotized by fake news. And I'll close by giving you a mental exercise. If the election, the last presidential election, had come out the other way, would we have the same presentations? Would we have the same concerns? Because the kinds of things we should be talking about in terms of fundamental architecture should be more permanent, more resilient than that, in the way we set agendas forth. And I understand that that's an important political moment, but what we're talking about, if we're talking about platforms and data and political governments, those aren't things that changed as a result of the last election. Those are fundamental forces. What we should do is take them on their own terms and understand there are real problems. But to understand, my basic concern is that, in fact, there is a baby in the bathwater, or we have to do the exercise of thinking about what is the baby in the bathwater. and then finding ways to trade off the real problems that Julie and Yochai have pointed out to us against the real benefits, because I don't think any of us would ban platforms and data. So now it becomes a question of right-sizing the intervention, dealing with the gray area, which is hard and challenging and possibly ultimately intractable and therefore ends up in politics, but is the proper task for an academic institution to set up both sides of the problem and to find a way, the multiple forces on the other side, and do the complex optimization to make good decisions.
I think we've got time for a few
sure.
questions. So I don't know where you have the microphones.
Well, Julie has requested time to respond. So,
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, so just really briefly, because I do want people to ask questions also. Platforms, so to say platforms are good things is to kind of miss the point, right? So were factories, right? And yet we needed a protective counter movement to discipline factories. And the moment of pessimism is exactly what spawned the protective counter movement. It's almost like you have to get to the moment of pessimism before you can get past it. And to be talking about that possibility and the need for the protective counter movement is exactly to be talking about the long term. There is no reason, however, to think that the institutions that served us well before will be the same ones that we need to serve us well now. Antitrust law, right? Employment law, communications regulation, arguably are obsolete forms. So I do think it's a big task, but I'm exactly talking about the long term, and that's it.
Yochai?
Just, I think what was central to both of our presentations was rejection, the idea of techno-anything by itself, not pessimism, not optimism, but rather understanding the intersection between the two. I'd say that, yes, I'm not talking about the moment. I'm talking about the fact that we've seen lower productivity growth since 1973, except for a brief spurt in the late 90s and early 2000s, than we did in the prior 30 years, that we've seen stagnant wages in the US, but not across all of Europe, that we've seen increased top 1% interest with an attendant political destabilization that we haven't seen elsewhere. I'm talking political stabilization, not about fake news in this election. I'm talking from Duterte through Modi to Erdogan to Orban to Poland to Austria to Brexit to our election. This is a fundamental challenge in a way that would have been inconceivable in 2000. And yet here we are. So I think these are fundamental. We can't just look at our little area of policy without trying, when we believe that technology is what's changing the world, right? This is what brought us to this topic. And yet the world is not changing for the better. How that's happening, how much technology, how much institutions, that to me is the question. That is not a fake news last minute thing.
All right, Tim.
Thanks. So I mean, these are magnificent presentations, all three of you. I feel like, like I was at some classic concert or something. This was, I'm really privileged. So,
So weird, man.
well, they were awesome. Christopher, just to answer your question, I feel like I was concerned about like industrial concentration and inequality before the election, and now I still am, and now unfortunately I'm also concerned about nuclear war and fascism and racism. So that's basically one answer. But I want to ask each of you questions, and they're going to be kind of tough questions because why not? So, Yochai, I want to ask you a question that I actually think could be asked by Walter. It's not really my views, but could be like Walter Lippmann's or Sigmund Freud's views, which is, it'll go like this. Okay, Professor Benkler, as you said, you were naive. You thought that, maybe you believed that people were intrinsically good. And you hoped through the wealth of networks and interconnecting everybody that there'd be a great flourishing of all the best of humanity. And there maybe was a period in the, I think there was this, the early 2000s kind of idealistic period, early YouTube, early blogging, where it really seemed to be coming true and the best of humanity was coming out. But, at some deeper level, you were wrong about the nature of humanity. This is like a Freudian point, that people need repression. And maybe if preferences, I'm going to turn a little bit, maybe if preferences are endogenous, this is Walter Lippmann point, they need Walter Cronkite to tell them how to think and, be good citizens. And so you help unleash this monster And what do you say about that? Julie, this is a question. I wonder how you deal with this. You know, you talk about counter movements and the turn of the century. The point is often made, I'm not necessarily making it, but that the harms in those periods were visceral, were real. You know, people were being turned into sausages or working 90 hours a week. Here it seems, you know, the harms seem inchoate. People don't seem to care. Well, we talked about privacy earlier, whether they care or not. But you know that the counter revolution is hindered by the fact, maybe the lack of material harm or something, or it just seems, you know, the phrase will be used as the first world problem if you're addicted to Facebook or something like that. And I wonder how you deal with that question, that's a challenge for the counter movement.
I don't care.
Well, the question went to you first, Yochai, so why don't you start?
Okay, so actually, I just reread Public Opinion, unsurprisingly, since the election. And Lippmann, for those who don't. What's remarkable is that the first half of the book takes the following shape. New understandings in psychology and new communications technologies have made it possible to manipulate public opinion. It could have been written yesterday. It's really remarkable. So this basic question of how can you conceive of democracy other than in this Platonic sense of a set of guardians with manufacturing consent and managing through expertise, this to me is the great driver of what I saw as one of the possible ideologies. That's what I see as nudge progressivism. We'll use the data to understand how to make people's lives better. We will trust the experts to have good intentions. And we will use the best science to manipulate the population in order to achieve the best for them. I think that would ignore past failures of such models, but I definitely see us as being driven towards a more Churchillian view of democracy in terms of worst system except for all the others, which also means in terms of design that we have to be more skeptical that even though I think I now recognize that we do need to harness the power of the state more than I thought was the case 10 years ago, I think we need to do it in ways that are polyarchic, diffuse, how you put power, how you actually create organizations that are not market but are more organized like nonprofits. So again, if you go and look at Barcelona and at what they're calling now the development of the public commons partnership, Barcelona, unfortunately, the politics may completely destroy what they're trying to do at the municipal level. But the effort to actually create very closely connected government to the people, feeding back, building local organizations, putting things not only for public-private partnerships with market firms, but also with NGOs and commons. That seems to me to be the domain of really interesting institutional innovation today. And the second point about human nature. I think there's been tremendous work since the late 90s suggesting that two things. One that's sort of back to you on the entrepreneur. Innovation as a historical and economic research matter doesn't start from individuals mostly. It starts from learning networks. As much about flow of knowledge in the creation as about stock and property. And that really, I think, pushes back on the entrepreneurial model you have, because I think even when it's businesses, not only when it's...
You mean that Schumpeter has, sorry.
Yeah, well, you're using it in your model. And the second point is the critical finding of most of this work is that human motivations are elastic and plastic, and so are responsive to the institutional and organizational structure within which it is. There's wide international variation based on background institutional settings in degrees of trust, in degrees of cooperativeness, in degrees of selfishness. And so the shape of human motivations is endogenous to the institutional structure that we build. And so if we assume selfishness, we'll build systems that will feed back into increased selfishness and vice versa. And I don't think that's an assumption. I think that is the best state of the art in social and behavioral sciences today.
Julie.
So I think it has been a problem for a while, the view that the harms are inchoate and hard to grasp, but in the wake of Equifax and Charlottesville, it's becoming increasingly hard to maintain that view. The Atlantic has a wonderful feature on sort of the Andrew Anglin and the making of an American neo-Nazi, and you should look at it, right? The process of magnifying grievances and nurturing conspiracy theories is significantly enhanced by the fact that we have a YouTube to funnel the videos to the people who want to see them. I don't think we can ignore that. And it's not a first world problem. You know, tell that to the people in India who mobilized to battle the Aadhaar system and the free basics. The entire developing world is being used as a test bed for a lot of these technologies right now, and people do know it and they're not happy about it. So I think the potential for the recognition is there.
Helen.
Thank you. Fantastic presentations. This is going to be a complaint, however, and it's directed mainly to Yochai. So, what went wrong? Because the warnings of the privacy community have been expressed for ages, let's say at least a decade, talking about the accumulation of data, the aggregation, the purchasing of data properties. And here we're talking about, you know, market concentration and platform power and what's wrong with, you know, what's wrong with platform power. And why were the warnings of the it's more like what happened that the warnings of the privacy community that was focusing on what was going on for at least the past 10 years was somehow shunted to the side as if they had nothing to do with what's going on in the space of concentration and platforms. I loved your talk, though.
Cassandra's complaint. I think here's what I can take responsibility for in that. I think to the extent that my work represents a particular class of way of looking at the set of problems, the skepticism about the state was too great to mobilize around a strong intervention through the state. I think projects, even those that did focus on privacy and ended up focusing on P3P or PICs or all sorts of things that were about making sure that people knew and could make choices, as opposed to shifting to a muscular regulation. So privacy needs to be understood as environmental regulation or as public health regulation. You don't let people choose vaccines, except in certain corners of the US with really bad effects. So I think we need a fundamental shift, but I think certainly whoever sees themselves, my fault, the fault that is mine, however small the slice might be, is in being so concerned with the fallibilism of the state and with bringing in the fallibilism of the market into the picture as well, that I and others like me were looking for solutions that didn't involve recreation of power at an aggregate level and failed to provide this more powerful source of a solution. And I think this is one of the things we need to accept today, except in the post-Snowden era, and at a time when we're actually designing technologies and interventions that can be used as much by Modi and Erdogan as they can be used by Trump and Pruitt, that's also a problem. So I think we're stuck in that regard. And the other thing is money. Right? The amount of money that went into leveraging the ideology that said no, the state, that had both left and right versions, made it very hard to regulate in any meaningful way.
Got maybe 5 more minutes, Christopher.
All right. We have at least 2 questions. And one in the back, Neva. So let's, who hasn't spoken yet? Why don't you start here, then we'll go to Neva, and then we'll go to you in the back, please.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick question. In the context of these discussions, fantastic day, Kevin, and everybody that's been speaking. The one thing that didn't come up, unless I dozed off, was the question of regulatory capture. And as someone who spent 30 years in financial services, and the great US of A is the champion of the world of this, there's an enormous amount of regulatory capture. So even if you get all of this right, you know, especially with the worldviews that both of you and the frameworks that both of you developed, I'd be interested if you have any thoughts on how to avoid that happening, or if it's an issue, if you think it's an issue.
Julie?
So I have a whole chapter on the regulatory state, so I'll try to be really brief. Capture runs on multiple levels, and part of the problem that we're struggling with right now, which Yochai kind of briefly touched on when he talked about notice and choice, is a kind of ideological capture. And it's not the market versus the state, and it is, I think, a very great mistake to sort of say the essence of the neoliberal moment is putting our faith in the market as opposed to the state. What has the essence of the neoliberalization of government is bringing the market into the state, right? So what has happened is not simply that there's a revolving door between the regulatory state and the market, or that there are ideologies, but that there is a, you know, regulatory processes have been captured from the inside out, so that what is the focus now is co-regulatory best practices governance and privatized audit and compliance, so that we have to, you know, take the Basel Accords, to get totally random, right? We have to accept the representations of the big money center banks that their risk models are good because they're the only ones who can understand them, right? That is just not okay. But within a sort of neoliberal frame of what the purpose of the state is, it is appropriate to delegate as much out and to, you know, to splinter the financial regulatory world so that you also introduce productive competition. You have regulators in competition with one another. And somebody's crazy theory is that you get good results out of that, which clearly we know to be a pipe dream, right? So, you know, we really have a lot of work to do, kind of unwinding all of that. I think working in our favor, though, is that we're not necessarily trying to get back to the regulatory state of yesteryear, right? But to get to something that's optimized to what we need for now.
So just to emphasize that central to what Julie said is we already operate under agency capture. So it's not as though the alternative is none. Second, we do know that there's high variation in the effectiveness of agencies, right? The Bureau of Labor Statistics is an amazing agency that completely determines politics and should be completely captured and completely isn't. Sometimes we know how to do it when we do it well, and certainly once you look at international and comparative models, you can. But that is, to me, I agree, a core design question. The second thing, I just can't stop myself, because earlier you were talking about government not keeping up with the times. And I just think we should adopt the Silicon Valley approach to government agency. Government should move fast and break things.
So we will take both these questions sequentially and then help them answer. Neva? Your mic is not on. Your mic is not on.
Sophisticated technologies. So I thought that this was a brilliant description of some of the processes that are shaping this environment, but just to follow up on the point that was made by Chris, the question is, when what is here to stay when you look at the technology now and you try to identify the issues that are going to affect us in the future as we are trying to design our policy. So for instance, Julie, you focused on platforms. What are the platforms that, I mean, it's like continuing to focus on Facebook when we're entering the Internet of Things would make little sense. So how do you describe a platform rather than by naming companies in terms of the structural issues or the more principled issue that we need to address? Or if to follow up on the point that Helen was making, is a problem with the data and privacy? The problem may be transitional, that people now need to, will learn how to address information pollution and privacy threats. And once we get over this literacy issue, we'll just know how to handle it. Like people used to learn how to handle machines, and we'll learn how to handle data pollution.
Last question. Please.
Hello? Yes. Helen, what went wrong? I just wanted to throw out a few comments. My name is Shoshana Zuboff. Just because I think the people in this room, not only the people in this room, but the people in this room are going to have to be dealing for the next decades fixing what went wrong. It really comes down to the people in this room are an important part of the vanguard. So I think a couple of things should be stated in the context of these brilliant presentations. One is that what went wrong is the arrival of the unprecedented. So that, there is a sociology of the unprecedented. How is it possible to recognize the unprecedented in our midst when there is something historically unprecedented? This was the challenge that scholars had in the face of totalitarianism. It was impossible to really reckon with it, to really name it, to really grasp its consequences as it was unraveling, because it was something unimaginable. It was something unprecedented. And I think between the age of Castells, which Yochai brought up, when Castells was very adamant, information capitalism is no big deal. Information capitalism is not a structural shift comparable to agriculture and industry. Information capitalism is simply doing the same things, only faster, more efficiently. Well, many of us were lulled into a kind of mechanical acceptance of these kinds of premises. And even as that was happening, there was something unprecedented gathering in our midst. I call it surveillance capitalism. The idea that there was a new market form, indigenous to the digital, unrecognizable when it came dressed up as young, hip geniuses who were giving us every single thing that we wanted. Surveillance capitalism is the well, you'll hear me say this in my talk tomorrow. The shark in the water beneath everything in your picture, Yochai. Because, when you start with the disenfranchised, the destruction of the labor share, which was in one sector of your picture, that's Castell's information capitalism. And that's capitalism, that's labor substitution. We know how to get mad at that. We know how to think about that. But as you're moving up your circle, you're moving into a new phenomenon of surveillance capitalism whose core element is indifference to its populations. It has no intrinsic reciprocal relationship with its populations. So now I'm looking at that work, which I love the study you did, and you've got your balloons of Breitbart and all those people in that space, there are bad actors at every moment. The difference is that under the regime of surveillance capitalism, bad actors suddenly are turned into clients. They're customers. Their bad actions are sources of monetization. And so something that would just, circle and maybe over a period of time peter out in its own space becomes amplified on a planetary scale.
Okay.
So we are dealing with a new form whose concentrations of knowledge and therefore power are unprecedented. And until we really put that mix of money and power, revenues and power, capital and power into the center of this question, we are never going to be able to extinguish this disfiguring power that is among us, or even begin to think about the countermoves that are now our challenge. And if those of us here aren't helping to figure that out, I don't think we can be pessimistic enough, quite frankly. Thank you.
Kevin's standing up.
So we're running very late. If you guys want to say a few more things, I don't want to cut this off, but I want to give us a chance to wrap up as we're running over. So go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to first of all thank Shoshana for that, and tie it a little more explicitly to the four suspects you talked about. I do think the shark in the water is the problem, and all the dark money, right? That's not where we regulate, right? Is really important to start figuring out how to look at. How do you describe a platform? There's a big literature on this, Christian, Tarleton Gillespie. Very briefly, a platform provides a generative surface and makes that possible using modular protocols that then create points of control, leverage, governance, and also surplus extraction. You're totally right, that the Internet of Things isn't Facebook, right? So if you look at Google is Google Home versus Amazon Alexa, Google versus Apple in the mobile iOS space, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google jockeying for cloud services, primacy, Facebook trying to get in on internet access in developing countries. Yes, I do think it's meaningful to talk about the big five on grounds of dominance and market cap alone. But nonetheless, you have a good point that if we were to kind of play God and erase the entire regulatory apparatus and start over, I don't know that it would be desirable. But I would want to think about it more to constitute an agency just for the purpose of regulating the big five. That said, I think if there is a silver lining in the criminal destruction of the regulatory state that's now underway in Washington, while we're all paying attention to people's tweets, it is that maybe we could think about reconstructing it along lines better optimized to the information economy if we ever get out from under. But yeah, there's some questions about what sets of categories or organizational structures are to be used, right? Do we have an agency for algorithms and another one for data? I don't know. But I absolutely think those are the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about.
Probably much better to do it over a glass of wine or a beer.
All right. Yeah. Thank you guys very much. Okay. So this has been tremendous food for thought. We have some food for bodies. If you go out to the left, and we'll continue the conversation there. Wonderful first day, people, and we'll come back tomorrow.